Just FYI, everyone, we're going to be a couple minutes delayed in the start as votes have been called on the House floor.
The subcommittee will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare a recess at any time during today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions. I know we have a guest, and I'd like to extend a special welcome to him. He's the newest member of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, Congressman Troy Carter of Louisiana. So I look forward to working with him on the committee. Without objection, so ordered. As a reminder, please keep your microphone muted unless you're speaking. Should I hear any inadvertent background noise, I request that the member please mute their microphone. To insert a document into the record, please have your staff email it to documentstni@mail.house.gov. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's hearing and thank our witnesses for joining us to discuss the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on the federal real estate portfolio and where we go from here. The past 14 months have really been overwhelming. Families across the country are struggling to make ends meet. Small businesses and schools have been forced to close their doors to curb the spread of the virus. The famed Las Vegas Strip, which I represent in the heart of my district, resembled a scene from an apocalyptic movie rather than a place that usually welcomes over 40 million visitors a year. With businesses closed, schools moving to virtual classrooms, and our highways and airports nearly empty, unemployment reached levels not seen since the Great Depression. Now, with the implementation of the American Rescue Plan, vaccination rates continue to rise, infections are dropping, and communities are starting to open back up. There is a light at the end of the tunnel. Of course, federal workers weren't spared the trauma of the past 14 months either. Even those who were fortunate enough to be able to work from home had to deal with the lack of child care, the challenges of online schooling, and the health and well-being of their family members. While working remotely wasn't ideal for all and was in fact challenging for many, the experiment in widespread remote work is widely considered a success, and it's prompting workers and employers to reimagine how and where work gets done going forward. These conversations are no longer theoretical. We are reopening. Hair salons, restaurants, and gyms are returning to full capacity. Tickets for Broadway shows are going on sale, and the first major conventions and trade shows are returning to Las Vegas this summer. Meanwhile, as state and local governments are also lifting restrictions, and corporate America ponders calling employees back into offices, discussions about office space are speeding up. How much office space will organizations need? Will workspaces need to be reconfigured? Will employee start and end times need to be staggered? Will companies require employees to be vaccinated before they return to work in their spaces? And will workers be allowed more flexibility to continue to work remotely? These are just some of the questions that are also relevant to this subcommittee because we authorized the acquisition of space for the GSA, General Services Administration. The GSA provides workspace for 1.2 million federal employees in every state and territory across more than 50 agencies at the federal level. GSA's Public Building Service owns over 1,500 federal buildings and leases approximately 8,100 office buildings, courthouses, land ports of entry, data processing centers, laboratories, and specialized space all across the country. With 60% of public building service leases expiring in the next few years and agencies contemplating new ways of working, the government needs to rethink its real estate portfolio. Currently, when agencies seek workspaces, GSA considers the amount of space needed, the type of space, the location, the neighborhood amenities, disaster risks such as seismic safety and fire protection, and of course, the price. As a result of the pandemic, GSA will have to also consider resilience, sanitation, airflow, spatial planning, and telework policies. The pivot will require GSA to consider how the built environment can help the government provide better services, attract and retain employees, and protect our workers' health. Today, we'll host the first of 2 hearings exploring these questions. In a moment, we will hear from expert stakeholders from the private sector with experience in the management, design, and construction of federal buildings and commercial spaces. In our second hearing, we will discuss these issues with the leadership of the GSA to understand their approaches to these questions. In the coming weeks or so, I look forward to hearing from them about what changes in policies, authorities, and regulations Congress can and should enact to meet these challenges and promote healthy and safe work environments while also protecting the interests of taxpayers. I want to once again thank our witnesses for being with us and for participating in today's discussion. We have heard a lot about your expertise and we're grateful for your testimony. I want to apologize in advance, however. Votes have been called, and you may see some people moving in and out. That is certainly no reflection on our interest in what you have to say. At this time, I would yield to the Mr. Guest. I'm not sure what your title is now, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chair Titus, and I also would like to thank our witnesses for joining us today. Prior to COVID-19, Congress made significant progress focusing on right-sizing federal office space. Through reductions and consolidations, we saved the American taxpayers over $4 billion. Through the bipartisan approach of focusing on freezing and then reducing federal office space, we are still seeing the savings produced by those efforts today. As we saw before the pandemic, office space design and uses were already changing, away from the needs for individual offices toward more open floor plans and shared spaces. These changes and the subsequent savings not only reduced costs for the taxpayers, but also freed up more resources for agencies to invest in their core mission. As a result of COVID, teleworking has increased exponentially across government. Early on, we didn't know how the impact was going to affect us and the results that it was going to have on the American work life. Would we need more overall office space for social distancing? Would this mean less space and more individual offices? How would we change to accommodate in-person services? If we look at the private sector trends, we are going to see that we will continue to see higher levels of teleworking and a further reduced need for current office space. What we have learned is we don't have to do things the same way we've always done them before. By leveraging technology and innovation and focus on what is actually needed in the built environment, we can save money, increase efficiency, and ensure space better supports agency missions. As we examine the future of federal office space, it is important for us to consider private sector trends, whether those trends make sense in the federal real estate context, and what issues and questions we should be addressing or asking. We also must examine how we can position GSA and other federal agencies to manage their real estate portfolios accordingly, and how those decisions best prepare them to execute their mission. In order to facilitate that, the right initiatives and tools need to be in the toolbox, and we must remove obstacles. For example, GSA should not be forced because of scoring rule interpretations to choose either traditional federal construction or operation leases. Public-private partnerships, discounted purchase options, and other flexible solutions must be on the table. Decisions need to be based on what makes sense for the agency mission and cost. That's why I'm pleased to be a sponsor and co-sponsors of bills along with Subcommittee Ranking Member Webster and Representative Pence that are designed to give the GSA more choices for P3s and to negotiate discounted purchase options that provide GSA with the needed flexibility to protect American tax dollars. As we saw with the Reduce the Footprint initiative, the right sizing the portfolio for future savings and upfront cost approach, we see that space needs to be reconfigured. Old space must be sold and new, more efficient space needs to be acquired. Ensuring GSA has real choices is critical to finding significant savings in our real estate portfolio. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and Madam Chair, I yield back.
I'd now like to welcome the witnesses to the panel. We have Ms. Genevieve Hanson, who is a principal at Ernst & Young, Ms. Kay Sargent, a senior principal at HOK, Ms. Marcy Owens-Test, a senior vice president at CBRE Federal Lesser Advisory Group, Mr. Norman Dong, managing director at FD Stonewater, and Ms. Kelly Bacon, principal at AECOM. We thank you all for being here today, and we look forward to your testimony. Without objection, our witnesses' full statements will be included in the record. Since your written statement has been made part of the record, the committee would require that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. So we'll proceed with the testimony, and Ms. Hanson, we'd invite you to go first.
Good afternoon, Chairman Titus, Ranking Member Guest, and subcommittee members. I'd like to thank the subcommittee and its staff for the opportunity to speak to you today on this important topic. I must say that Chairwoman and Ranking Member Guest, you probably summed up my talking points, but I'll continue. My name is Genevieve Hanson. I'm a principal with Ernst & Young in the strategy, transaction, and real estate practice. I've got over 25 years of experience of management consulting and real estate, both in public and private sectors. I had the pleasure of managing large-scale public-private partnerships at GSA, and I've also held the role of Chief Sustainability Officer at Department of Health and Human Services, while serving as an Associate Deputy Assistant Secretary for Real Estate and Supply Chain Operations. The views that I express today in the written and oral testimony are of my own and not necessarily those of Ernst & Young, LLP, or other members of the global EY organization. Over the past 20 years, there has been a slow evolution to now a revolution in how real estate is managed, largely dependent on COVID-19, meaning that work schedules, places of work, seat assignments, and the use of a range of spaces have been democratized. The focus of this testimony is primarily on the office environment. Currently, we're experiencing a significant transformation, as you've noted, in where, when, and how millions of Americans work, principally in order to mitigate health and safety concerns while maintaining business operations and the like. Today, the pandemic has only intensified the focus on healthy buildings and workplaces, namely to support physical, social, psychological health and well-being of those that use the space. These elements include air quality, energy efficiency, building materials, plantings, lighting, sanitized workspaces, wayfinding, accessibility, fitness, relaxation, and comfort. Processes and technologies are being re-engineered and innovated to enhance the employee experience. Notably, COVID-19 has been an accelerant in increasing the flexibility of work schedules and work locations. As a result, organizations are reevaluating their real estate requirements, performance metrics, productivity, ability to work in the office and remotely, culture, and change management. Decision makers from all sectors are asking themselves the same question. How much should the current pandemic environment influence our short-term and long-term real estate decisions? As you said, depending on its mission, goals, structure, and operations, an organization may need to expand, contract, or simply modernize their real estate portfolio. It's important to note that millions of Americans never left their work sites because they provide products and services that are vital to our everyday lives. I'd like to highlight 3 areas within this rubric of healthy buildings and workforce well-being to consider: people, real estate, and technology. The first key area is people. The pandemic has emphasized the need to keep people at the center of business decisions. Remote working or telework has transitioned from being a perk to being commonplace, yet the need for in-person interactions remains strong in order to collaborate, to team, to mentor, and connect. When considered thoughtfully, innovative workplaces and workplace flexibility can play a pivotal role in attracting and retaining talent, as well as enhancing operational efficiencies. The second area is real estate. The real estate and construction sector combined represents approximately a sixth of our economy, and the federal footprint comprises 1 billion square feet. With more than 350,000 energy utilizing buildings and 600,000 vehicles, the federal government is the nation's largest energy consumer. Therefore, it matters how public and private sector work in partnership to support the health, safety, and well-being of people in its facilities. Prior to COVID, there has been a 20-year trend towards a more sustainable federal footprint. As we emerge out of the pandemic, we will see an even greater focus on amenitizing sustainability through smart building design, high energy efficiency, HVAC systems, supplemental air purification systems, workplace sanitization, and improved water and waste management. Deeper collaboration and solutioning between federal government and private sector can speed up innovative sustainability. The race to innovate bleeds into the third key area, which is technology. In recent years, real estate has evolved from systems that keep singular, disconnected, and analog to a more multidimensional, connected, and digitally integrated network of smart buildings technologies. As we move forward, connectivity among the workforce and data will become key tenets for continuity of operations, collaboration, and decision-making. The pandemic has increased the need to consider and scale workplace technologies to advance efficient real property management, such as Internet of Things, robotic process automation, chatbots, artificial intelligence, and virtual collaborative tools. In closing, several force multipliers can further shift this evolution of enhanced real estate management to a revolution. This includes deep collaboration with private sector, prioritizing initiatives, re-engineering processes, developing durable policies, and enhancing governance. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the subcommittee, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Hanson. Ms. Sargent?
Chairman Titus, Ranking Member Guests, and members of the committee. First, on behalf of the International Facility Management Association, IFMA, and our 20,000 members who run commercial buildings internationally in over 100 chapters, including strong chapters in Oregon and Nevada, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. IFMA is the largest professional association for facility managers, and our members run billions of square feet of commercial space. As the leader of the global workplace practice at HOK, one of the largest architectural firms in the world, I can tell you that at no time has the essential role of the facility manager been clearer than over the last year. FMs in the private and public sector have met the challenge of the pandemic, and now they have the critical role in safely reopening and maintaining America's building infrastructure. This is a historic time. In my 37-year career as a workplace strategist and designer, this is the first real opportunity we have had to rethink how and where we work. Before the pandemic, the rise of co-working was already disrupting the commercial real estate market and changing our perspectives on the workplace. This has been reflected in congressional establishment of the Public Building Reform and Savings Board and the investment in FMs through the Federal Building Training Personnel Training Act. Then COVID hit, bringing our industry to a crossroads. The average building stands for over 70 years. Interior spaces are typically only renovated once a decade, if even that. In other countries, spaces are flipped more frequently, thus they can evolve and react to things in a more timely manner. Your decisions will determine the fate of the federal work environment for the next generation of Americans. The pandemic sent us all home, but the last year has taken a heavy toll on our citizens' physical and mental health, with a disproportionate impact on women, racial, and ethnic minorities. Now, thankfully, we can start to think about returning to the office. But as we do, the whole entire world is asking a really simple question. What is the future of work? Even before COVID, our offices weren't working. Many offices didn't support the collective ways that we work, the technology we rely on, our flatter organizational structures, or the need to focus on operations and maintenance, not just on design and construction. One thing we know for sure, the office of yesterday is not the answer. Companies now are in a fierce war for talent and a race to innovate. To attract the best and to give them what they need to succeed, we need to rethink their space. Designing spaces around the world has given us insights into how aggressive other countries are in innovating to create smart cities and state-of-the-art environments. We need to transform from a place that people have to go to an ecosystem of spaces where people want to be. We need to break down the silos, offer options and choices that are flexible and resilient to business changes. There are three main components to the next generation of this ecosystem that supports hybrid work. The hub, which is the reimagined office or the primary place where people come together, the home where you might be doing that solo remote work, and the spoke, which is a plug and play space outside of the hub that might offer more amenities than the home, like a co-working space or a satellite office. In this new ecosystem, overall office space per agency can be reduced while providing more enticing environments that better meet the needs and give greater experiences to the workforce. We need to continue to invest in people that are running our buildings. New requirements for building performance require additional investment in facility managers. Smarter buildings require smarter people. I'm also honored to serve as an advisor to GSA's Workplace 2030 Task Force looking at these issues. This group knows what needs to be done, but they need a bigger platform and a mandate to do it. The main takeaway that I want to leave you here with today is that we must create government workplaces that empower the American ingenuity and keep us competitive in global markets. We have a unique opportunity now to create government workplace ecosystems where the most exceptional people want to be, but we must take steps today to do so. If we do, we can help our public building sector improve environmental and human sustainability and well-being. We can address safety and productivity and preserve their asset value and performance. Thank you again for inviting me to be here on behalf of IFMA. We stand ready to help, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Sargent. Your background indicates that's an environment where we would all like to be. It's lovely, thank you.
I'd be
Ms.
happy to
Owens-
design a space for you.
Ms. Owens-Test.
Thank you so much for inviting me to share my expertise in the federal real estate space. Because I've worked in the field of federal government real estate for 32 years, I have a broad perspective and would like to share some insights into the federal leasing arena and express the importance that leasing has in the overall real estate strategy. In a phrase, I'm here to champion leasing and speak on behalf of the landlord community. The federal government, including such agencies as the U.S. Postal Service, Department of Agriculture, Department of Commerce, Department of Veterans Affairs, and the U.S. General Services Administration, use leasing to fulfill tens of thousands of real estate requirements across the country. Specifically, the General Services Administration inventory includes 7,859 leases as of April of 2021. And although this number reflects a 15% reduction over the last 10 years from the peak, due to space consolidations and relocations to federally owned space, the overall leasing square footage remains close to 50% of the total GSA inventory. Leasing allows the tenant to address changing space requirements over time, enables the use of efficiently operated high-quality space, and provides access to private sector capital when needed to respond to changing missions. All this and the ability to terminate its obligation when the space no longer fits the tenant's needs. Leasing provides flexibility. The government uses leasing to lead the commercial real estate market by establishing requirements and reinforcing code compliance, for security, handicap accessibility, sustainability, and now COVID. The government has used leasing to implement other priorities through its standard lease contract terms. Leases are executed with a wide array of real estate owners, from sole proprietorships to single-purpose entities owned in complex corporate structures. Federal government leasing impacts a large portion of the commercial real estate market and has a wide influence. Government requirements can take years to plan, approve and budget. And even though we are working through the pandemic, the government should continue its business of leasing activity in both smaller and prospectus level leases because flexibility is built into the government lease. If government space requirements change over time, GSA has rights in the lease to negotiate changes. Because of the budget process, once a requirement is released to the commercial market, the government has likely been planning that requirement for 2 to 3 years, and large prospectus projects could take many more. Procurement and delivery of the leased space may take another 2 to 4 years. For this, leasing plans are made for long-term use, meaning 10 to 20 years, and sometimes 30-year periods. Also, federal agencies have a wide array of missions and use real estate many ways. There isn't a one-size-fits-all type space. Therefore, the government's implementation of real estate strategies takes a long time. For large leases, prospectuses authorize the ceilings of square footage and dollars, and the approval process can continue while specific deal terms are negotiated. Collaboration is where the best of the federal government and landlord community can find successful outcomes. Planning and budgeting are important for landlords too. It can take years for landlords to plan, design, permit, finance, construct, and occupy new buildings. Landlords' planning and collaboration with their teams result in the best built environment at the most effective cost. Neither the government nor the landlord community want to overpay or be inefficient with their real estate usage. Whether it is while creating new sustainability goals for the government's leased inventory and executing them in existing leases or compromising on space utilization, the private sector can bring implementation strategies to federal leases that provide the best overall cost solutions for federal tenants. Ultimately, the government receives the best pricing from the private sector because the government provides confidence and certainty in meeting its obligations, payment of rents, and likelihood of renewal. And the financial markets respond well to income streams they can count on. The government uses leasing as a strategy to get the best space for their real estate needs at the best available pricing from the commercial real estate community by providing consistent and collaboration, even when changing priorities are implemented. Thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dong.
Madam Chair, Ranking Member Guest, and members of the committee and the subcommittee, my name is Norman Dong, Managing Director with FD Stonewater. Our firm is a brokerage, development, and investment firm with extensive experience in federal real estate, and I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. Over the past decade, I've had the opportunity to engage in federal real estate from several vantage points. From the tenant agency perspective, when I was at FEMA as the CFO, when I was at OMB as the Deputy Controller, I saw the federal policy perspective. And when I was at GSA, we managed thousands of projects across the owned and leased portfolio each year to meet the needs of our federal tenants. While I learned a lot about federal real estate during my time in government, I've learned even more since I left GSA. And there are some important lessons from the private sector that can be brought to bear on the challenges we face. Today, many agencies face significant uncertainty about their real estate needs in the aftermath of the pandemic. Does the recent increase in telework reflect a temporary measure to get through the current public health crisis, or is it a more permanent way of doing business? And as the government considers its future space needs, it's important to understand what we've experienced, as well as what we've learned over the past 15 months. Without doubt, the remote work proof of concept we've seen over the past year will have lasting implications. Many employees have lived both the benefits and the shortcomings of remote work. and few may be willing to give up the increased flexibility and reduced commute time we've grown accustomed to during the pandemic. It seems clear that we will never revert back to the workplace-centric model we once knew. Nor will we maintain the scale of remote work we saw during the height of the pandemic. According to one recent workplace survey, at least 80% of employees want to return to the office at least one day a week. Some agency missions, such as law enforcement, lab research, national security, and public-facing functions, they cannot be performed effectively through telework. And for many people, myself included, working from home will never provide the type of workplace setting that fosters the type of communication, collaboration, and innovation to advance agency mission. COVID compels us to rethink conventional wisdom in managing the federal real estate portfolio. Take, for example, large-scale federal construction projects like DHS at St. Elizabeth's. After a year where much of the workforce has worked remotely, is the original value proposition of co-locating thousands of employees still valid? Or does it make sense to follow a different approach, one that reflects what we've learned over the past year, where many employees have been able to work productively without being tethered to a single physical location? In many ways, COVID has been an accelerant that compels the federal government to confront management challenges that predate the pandemic. This includes improving agency space utilization across the owned and leased portfolio, disposing of underutilized properties and identifying a more productive use for these assets, and addressing the significant backlog of maintenance, repair, and renewal needs across an aging federal portfolio. As a former agency CFO, I often view these real estate challenges through a budgetary lens. For example, this year, GSA only received 39% of its total capital budget request. And over the past decade, its list of capital project needs has far exceeded the availability of capital funds. So as the government evaluates its future space needs, the time has come for GSA to consider the right mix of owned, leased, and flexible office space to address agency space requirements while recognizing the current fiscal reality. We should take a minute to recognize the progress that has been made in managing the federal real estate portfolio over the past decade. Since 2012, GSA has reduced its leased inventory by more than 15 million square feet, and it has saved billions of dollars in leasing costs. In 2016, the Volpe Exchange reflected how GSA can leverage its existing authority to harness the development potential of an underutilized asset and realize more than $750 million in value for the federal government. And GSA continues to lead the way in sustainability and environmental stewardship. Since 2010, GSA's energy and water consumption have decreased by 24% and 36% respectively, and almost a quarter of GSA's federally owned portfolio is LEED certified. These and other examples demonstrate both the progress and the potential to manage the federal real estate portfolio more effectively. And they demonstrate how sometimes the right answer is not about the need for more money or additional authorities, but a more deliberate focus on execution, impact, and results. Members of the subcommittee, I very much appreciate the opportunity to be with you this afternoon, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Ms. Bacon?
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, Chair Titus, Ranking Member Guest, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is Kelly Bacon, and I am the Global Lead for ACOM Workplace Advisory Practice, a design and consulting studio that delivers strategic workplace planning and interior design services to public and private organizations worldwide. Our practice works with a diversity of organizations across the globe. Some of the U.S. government entities include GSA, DoD, Department of Homeland Security, Department of State, and NASA, to name a few. We have also worked extensively in the private sector with a number of Fortune 500 organizations, including Estee Lauder companies, Pfizer, Marsh & McLennan. We are a diverse mix of individuals in architecture, interiors, urban planning, and organizational psychology. My personal background is in sociology and predictive analytics, so my approach to this topic is that of a societal context with which our offices operate and the responsibility they play to the workforce as a whole. So I'm honored to be here today to share my perspective, as I truly believe our society is experiencing a once-in-a-generation opportunity to rethink our relationship to work and workplaces. As has already been said by every member who has spoken here today, the pandemic has been a great accelerator for remote working and hybrid work arrangements. I will say, long before COVID-19, our team has been advising organizations to embrace telework as part of a holistic real estate and workplace strategy. Doing so can and has resulted in significant spatial savings through a combination of space sharing, remote working, and technological investments, enabling internal and external mobility. Historically, we've seen two primary obstacles to alternative workplace strategies, and those are both cultural and technological. The technological, of course, has to do with investment, cybersecurity, and commercial adoption curves, which is something that the federal government has struggled with compared to the private sector. This past year, we have seen the stigma of remote working has been lifted. Organizations of all scale, all sizes, and all locations have realized its efficacy. We've also seen significant technological investments have been made out of absolute necessity and mission resiliency in order to maintain and to continue operating. We've also seen new behaviors have been developed, and we need to maximize and leverage these new behaviors. We've heard extensive reports from our clients of individual and organizational productivity, and every member who has spoken so far has already testified as such. However, there's a downside to the all or nothing conditions we are working in, the reports of isolation, the loss of culture and camaraderie, and in some cases, we realize not everyone has the appropriate conditions in their home to work remote. We cannot, as we consider a hybrid future, cannot leave those folks behind. I want to be clear, as much as I advocate for teleworking, humans are a social species. We thrive through connectivity and collaboration. So place matters, and offices play a critical role in our society, both for the individual, the organization, and of course, to stimulate the communities with which they reside. So I shared extensive research and anecdotal evidence in my written testimony, and here I offer three statistics to support my oral statement. We've done extensive research in partnership with Mercer, who is a Fortune 500 human resources consulting firm, and 82% of CHROs say their organization is planning to adopt a flex arrangement. The combination is bespoke to the institution and the mission requirements, but it is the path forward that we're seeing in the private sector. 71% of the workforce say they prefer to be in the office 2 to 3 days a week and work remote the rest, which again is consistent with what I've heard from my colleagues here. One thing I do also want to offer is 56% of employees say that they would consider finding another employer if some level of flexibility weren't made available to them in the future. And let me clarify, we are talking about administrative and office workers, not the specialty labs and retail and other workforces that we just discussed. This is a critical statistic to keep in mind as we think about what the hybrid future is. In short, as others have said, the purpose of our offices are now being redefined. They will serve as a place to enable collaboration and culture, and the interactions in the office will be more purposeful. In my written testimony, I provide details of examples of what needs to happen for this to occur. In the interest of expediency, having been the last witness, I will offer 3 primary steps needed to realize these benefits. We need to fully embrace the idea of activity-based planning, which is to create the spaces which support specific activities, not simply assigning space based on headcount, title, and hierarchy. We need to invest in change management, the development of new behavioral protocols and standard operating procedures, leveraging the learnings of this past year, leverage the management style enhancements of this past year, focusing on results, not managing by presenteeism. Now, while most agree with this conceptually, we find that as folks are considering the future, the resistance to these concepts is still palpable. So it's critical that we educate the federal workforce and leadership on the benefits of activity-based planning and remote working in order to strike the right balance. And then finally, we also need to work with the federal government and the GSA to identify pilot locations to test these new concepts in a controlled way before applying them across the broader portfolio. So I also believe we are at a turning point as we emerge from the pandemic. We are seeing organizations and agencies make decisions after deferring for the past year. It is critical we not default to old behaviors and approaches simply because they are familiar. We have a unique opportunity in front of us. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Bacon. We'll now have to take just a brief recess to run and vote, and then we'll reconvene just as quickly as possible. Thank you for your patience. We'll be right back. come back to order? Okay. Subcommittee will come back to order. Thank you for waiting for us. Mr. Guest and I are back. Ms. Norton kind of held down the fort for us. We'll now move on to the member questions. Each member will be recognized for 5 minutes, and I'll start by recognizing myself. Ms. Sargent, maybe we could begin with you. You mentioned in your testimony that you're on the GSA's Workplace 2030 Task Force. Could you elaborate a little on that, what you all are doing, if there's an emphasis on reducing office density, some of the recommendations that you see coming out of that task force?
Yes, ma'am, happy to. I only serve as an advisor, so I get to see what they're doing on occasion. But the last report that we had that we all looked at, they really are looking at a variety of things. They're looking at infrastructure, they're looking at technology, they're looking at security, they're looking at the overall portfolio and the footprint and new ways of working. Some of that entails down different silos and enabling remote work. And that could be through training, could be through new tech tools, new apps, things like that. And really looking at how do they empower people to be able to have the greatest flexibility that then enables the government to have the greatest flexibility as far as how they address the support.
Great. Well, we're going to be hearing from them in the next round, and so we want to ask them about that and get some more detail about what they're concluding. Ms. Hanson, I'd like to ask you about some of the things you referred to. There's that section of the regulations that nobody knows about except you experts, and it's kind of a holy grail to you, in the GSA Leasing Desk Guide that talks about sustainability and environmental considerations. I've noticed that that section hasn't been updated since 2012, and so much has changed since then, and again changed because of the virus. What signal does this send to the commercial world that we're so far behind, and how do you suggest we revise that or encourage GSA or mandate GSA, bring those up to date?
Madam Chairwoman, that's a great question, and that guide is one of our corporate Bibles. I'm not at a position to recommend what GSA does or doesn't do, but I can say that the desk guide allows for supplemental documents and supplemental data as well as negotiations. The desk guide does focus on sustainable requirements in design and construction of either new or replaced facilities. But it also refers to OSHA standards and a net zero energy strategy. The good news is that much of the private sector has been working with GSA on the different initiatives. A lot of the goals are focused on 2030. You've got American Institute of Architects that has a 2030 goal. You've got Living Building 2030 Challenge, and as well as ASHRAE, Architecture and Engineering Vision 2030. Thank
Great.
you.
Well, it seems to me that needs to be brought up to date from 2012. So looking more at sustainability, green buildings, things that save energy and also are more healthy, doing well by doing good. It seems to me if we could update that. What I would now ask Mr. Dong, we've talked a lot about the telework policies. Given your experiences both in government and in the private sector and your understanding of how federal decision-making works, would you advise each agency to have its own policy, or do you think that we should look at some overall policy that can be a guide and set a single standard?
I think it's important to address this issue at an agency level, and I'll tell you why. But let me step back and just say that the remote work proof of concept that we've seen over the past year is going to have lasting implications. And during the pandemic, there was this aha moment where we discovered how large numbers of employees can work productively without being tethered to a single location. And that can have a tremendous impact on an agency's ability to recruit and retain talent across the country. That having been said, we cannot lose sight of agency mission and function. And we must recognize that some specialized functions, like national security or laboratory research, for example, don't really lend themselves to telework that well. And it's not just about the overall agency mission or function, but it's also about actual job requirements of specific positions. Some jobs may require a physical presence in the office and others may not. So ultimately, I do believe that this is going to be an agency by agency decision where each agency sets remote work policy in a way that most effectively supports its mission.
Thank you. Ms. Owens-Test, we heard from you and from a number of people that these leases for the GSA don't happen overnight. They take 2, 3, 5 years sometimes. Could you talk about some of the leases that are in process now that were not originally formulated to meet the challenges of COVID, and they things that are a problem now weren't a consideration 2 or 3 years ago? How do we change authorities to make those accommodations?
Well, I appreciate the question. It's a tough one for sure because of the diversity and the different agencies' needs, missions, and the type of workspace that they need. For the most part, leases are flexible enough to accommodate changes in the agency's requirements. And what we need to start with is, are the agencies building their requirements and changing their requirements that can be articulated to landlords in existing leases? We are only beginning now to see in the market examples where leases are ending, where tenants are going to be consolidating into other spaces, where there haven't appeared to be plans yet for the new workspace. So we're looking forward to how the new workspace will be articulated in the upcoming round of requirements. But it's going to take time for agencies to develop those space requirements and understand what the needs of the tenants are, largely waiting for tenants to actually, and employees to actually return to the office and then see how they are impacting the spaces that they're utilizing. So we'll need to come back to the office, we think, before real fulsome requirements can be developed.
Okay, thank you. Now I recognize Mr. Guest.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Ms. Sargent, want to take a moment and talk briefly about public-private partnerships. This is something that I have a great interest in. I have co-sponsored legislation along with a representative from Indiana, Greg Pence, to direct GSA to conduct a pilot program using the public-private partnership. And you addressed that in some of your written testimony. You say, as Congress looks to update the federal real estate portfolio, IFMA, recommendations, broad-based considerations of related factors, including, and you list several, and the last one you list there is the utilization of public-private partnerships to help reduce operation and maintenance backlogs. And just wanted to see if you could take a few moments and expand on how the use of the public-private partnership could help reduce those operations and maintenance backlogs.
Absolutely, happy to do that. And I'm going to actually have a few other of the panelists maybe tag in on this one too. So there's a long history in the private sector of trying to create smarter ways of doing business and creating these partnerships so that the burden is really spread across. And I think one of the things that we can start looking at is, how do we ensure bringing the best of what the federal government does and the private sector does together to be able to not only go after some of these opportunities, but how we run them and manage them and oversee them, so that we're bringing the best of both, right? And so it's really about leveraging the expertise that each brings, opportunity and the power of the government, and maybe the initiation or the resiliency of the private sector, really all coming together to do that. And whether it's the way that we partner in funding some of these operations and or manage them afterwards, I think there's lots of different opportunities for us to explore there.
And if any of the other witnesses would love to hear your opinion on that, if anyone has any follow-up to Ms. Sargent. If not, then Ms. Sargent, while I've got you, I'll stick with you for just a minute and want to kind of continue to talk a little bit about what's going on in the private sector. We know that the federal government is often competing with other employers, many in the private sector, for the best and the brightest talent. And you talk about that also in your written statement, where you say companies know that they are in a fierce war for talent and a race to innovate, to attract the best and to give them what they need to succeed. They are rethinking their space. You go on to say we need to transform the office from a place where people have to be to an ecosystem of spaces where people want to be, spaces that break down silos and offer choices about how to work. And was wondering if you could expand on that and speak on what we're seeing as far as in the private sector, the trends that we're seeing, and then how we can implement that into our federal model.
Yeah, I think it really goes back to that whole ecosystem. So during this entire pandemic, we have repeatedly heard about productivity, right? Studies for the last 20 years have shown that people that work remotely tend to work longer hours than their office-bound cohorts. Typically, they just roll that commute time into it. Okay, but I think we're overly focusing on the word productivity. Just because I empty my inbox faster than the next person doesn't mean I've really produced anything. And what's keeping CEOs up at night before COVID was not necessarily could they produce a widget fast enough. It was, can we innovate fast enough, even stay relevant? Are we doing the right things? And often productivity can happen when people are remote, but when you really want to innovate, that comes synergy and building that social capital. And social capital is eroding during this time. And so understanding that different things happen in different places is important. So having this ecosystem 2 or 3 days a week when I'm doing my heads down concentrated work, that might happen at home. But when I need to connect with my colleagues and innovate and flesh out ideas and banter things back and forth, having a place that we can physically do that, we can build social capital, is absolutely essential. And that is what is disrupting every industry right now. And so needing both of those is really, really important. And nobody's talking about what is happening with innovation activity during this time. It's all just about productivity. And I think in the beginning, people were very productive because, quite frankly, people were afraid for their jobs. So they were working long, hard hours, but that is taking a toll on individuals. So we need to create that balance where we can have focused work and those opportunities for people to come together, build that social capital, innovate so that we can even stay relevant.
Thank you. Madam Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Norton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is an important hearing for the government, of course, but it's also important for my district because so much of the office space is in the nation's capital and therefore brings federal workers to the nation's capital and has an effect on the DC economy. But that's not what my question is about. I want to go first to Ms. Sargent, Ms. Kay Sargent, about smart buildings and what that really means in this transition. How will this, I'm interested in employees and I'm interested in jobs.
Yep.
How would this impact the number and quality of jobs? And would it change the number of people who are employed in that particular sector?
So what we want is for people that are working to spend their time doing things that are more advantageous, to make better use. 80% of an organization's money goes towards their people cost. Okay, if we do anything in the portfolio to squeeze the real estate and or have it be ineffective, we could actually cost the government more money than we save it if we make environments where people aren't thriving. So we have to think about the most valuable asset is the people and how do we make them as productive as possible. And I want you to think about this right now. I can start my car without even leaving my house. And by the time I can warm it up, and when I get there, the car knows that it's me because I have a fob in my pocket. It automatically turns on. Everything in the car is automatically adjusted to my preset preferences, the radio, the temperature, the seat, etc. Most of us in our workplaces are still crawling around under our desk trying to find an outlet. Okay, we are so far behind in leveraging the technology that already exists to create better
So do
experiences.
you think this will have an effect on the number of employees in every particular sector?
I think it will have an effect on the productivity that each employee can do. The number of employees, that's debatable. What you get out of those employees would absolutely be better because they're not spending time doing things that are ridiculous. They're getting to their job, they're more satisfied, and you can compete with the best and the brightest, so you have the best and the brightest
Well,
in the
that's an
government.
important clarification. Ms. Hanson and perhaps also Ms. Test, in the era of climate change, I have questions for each of you. If the federal government were to shift and require green leases and healthy building certifications, how would the private sector adapt to accommodate to that demand? That's for you, Ms. Hanson, and I note that you have worked for the DC government, and Ms. Owens-Test.
Great. Thank you, Congresswoman. And good to see you again. We worked together on St. Elizabeth's when I was with the DC government. But your question is a great one. Private sector is already making a lot of advancements in the area of green leases and sustainability. Really, it's been part of a collaboration on the federal government space requirement side. But there's been tremendous advancements on greenhouse gas reductions, in particular carbon emissions, smart metering, sensors on chairs and desks and offices, touchless features, sensor-based lighting as well, biodiversity focus, renewables, as well as stormwater management. So the private sector is certainly framing the conversation and leading the charge in this area, and will continue and invites really the federal government to work with them as they advance in more technological areas.
Ms. Owens-Test, do you have any comments on that question about green leases and healthy building certifications?
Yeah, GSA really was out in front of the market on this issue when it came to surface around 2000, when GSA really modified its lease requirements to incorporate many of the sustainability features that we see today that are now being incorporated into the private sector building codes, et cetera. And so GSA really supports local codes. The district is a leader in this as well. And GSA has the ability to incorporate the green lease modifications that they need into the leases through their requirements for performance. And we think that it would be good to have continued coordination with the private sector on what are the features that can be incorporated in the short term versus the long term as we look to more and more innovation within this part of the industry.
Thank you, and I yield, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Guest, is Mr. Jimenez available to ask a question right now? Well, if he is, we'll come back to him. Is Mr. Carter with us, or is he still voting? Mr. Carter? Well, if he gets back, we'll come back to him. It's interesting you mentioned how much the private sector is already doing for green building. Certainly we see that in Las Vegas. At one time we had 10 major buildings, the hotels and casinos that met the LEED gold standard. So I know there is an incentive for the private sector to build to those new standards. So requiring that for leases with the GSA doesn't seem like it would be that difficult. And I agree with Ms. Norton, that's something we ought to look at. Shall we do another round of questions, Mr. Guest, Ms. Norton, while we wait and see if they show up? Thank you. I would ask Mr. Dong, because the amount of funds that are available in the Federal Buildings Fund for new construction and repairs, alterations, has decreased below the amount of receipts that have been received by the GSA from its tenants. Several solutions have been proposed for alternative ways of funding projects. We've already heard some discussion about public-private partnerships. There are also discounted purchase options and the new federal capital revolving fund concept, which would finance the construction of new federally owned non-defense buildings. GSA has the legal authority to carry out those P3s, I guess, and discounted purchase options, but the Office of Management and Budget's interpretation of budgetary scoring rules require GSA to have the full amount of budgetary authority for a project up front, and that's often difficult to achieve. Mr. Don, would you talk about how OMB's forceful application of scoring rules impact GSA's construction projects? And if the federal capital revolving fund concept could enable agencies to finance those non-defense buildings without eating up all of their annual appropriations?
Sure. Let me start with some perspective on scoring, and then we'll move to the federal capital revolving fund. First, on scoring, the headline for me is that federal scoring rules don't work very well. They hamstring the ability of the federal government to address the needs of an aging portfolio, and they don't really provide the type of fiscal discipline they were intended to achieve. OMB Circular A11 makes a distinction between operating leases and capital leases based on a number of factors, including overall lease term, the length of the value of the lease payments, and whether there is a bargain purchase option included in the mix. What we've seen, though, is that current scoring rules effectively limit GSA terms to about 15 to 20 years. However, there are many examples of federal tenancies that extend 30 to 40 years in the same location. So as a result, GSA is resorting to a workaround through multiple short-term, higher-cost lease transactions that technically scores operating leases to allow for more favorable budgetary treatment. However, because the government is unable to commit to longer firm terms for leasing, the government ends up paying higher rates as landlords incur more expensive financing costs. The problem with scoring rules is that they're conflating the concepts of funding and financing. They're two separate issues. For me, it's a lot like buying a house. Could you buy your house, or in this case, rent your house, if you had to pay for the entire cost of your occupancy, which could run 20 to 30 years, in 1 year? The answer is most of us could not. So I think the time has come for us to step back, evaluate how well federal scoring rules are working, and perhaps we should take a cue from the private sector or from state and local governments, which have discovered and have embraced far more current ways of funding and financing these projects. So let me just skip back to the federal capital revolving fund, which you mentioned. To me, that's a step in the right direction because it reflects a far more rational process for budgeting for large-scale capital projects. If you look at the current federal budgeting process, it's a bit myopic because the budget for agencies is set in 1 year at a time. And it's difficult to budget for large-scale capital projects when the entire cost of the project has to be covered in a single year. And when that one project can run several hundreds of millions of dollars or several billions of dollars, that one project can crowd out a huge portion of an agency's annual budget. In contrast, if you look at the state and local capital budgeting system, it's different. They've got a capital budgeting process that allows for the cost of these large-scale projects to be spread across multiple years. So when you look at the federal capital revolving fund and what's being proposed there, it's embracing some of the key concepts of capital budgeting. It provides a $10 billion upfront appropriation on the mandatory side of the budget, and it allows agencies to tap into the fund to cover the cost of large projects without having to absorb the entire cost in a single budget year. And then agencies and paying back the fund in annual increments over 15 years through regular discretionary appropriations. So for me, the way I see it, it's a more rational way of budgeting for these projects because it allows agencies to spread the cost over multiple years instead of having to absorb the entire cost in year one.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Ms. Bacon, I agree with your assessment here where you say in your written statement that the COVID-19 pandemic has caused widespread adoption of remote work. You go on to say hybrid work models will become the norm in office-oriented industry. But I think, and we would all agree, that there are some functions, there are some activities that do require a physical presence in office buildings to get accomplished. And so my question is, would you take a minute and kind of talk about how do we evaluate those activities, those functions that require physical presence versus those that we can now do remotely? And I think you gave an example in your testimony of about a financial trading company that thought it was required to have all the work done within the office, but now they're planning to return back using a hybrid model. So can you kind of talk about those things which we would use to evaluate what can be done remotely, what can be done by hybrid model, and then those things which require individuals to actually physically be present in an office or workplace?
Great, thank you. That is a wonderful question and a complex one at that. There's a number of different ways that an organization agency needs to approach that very thing. There's job design, there's organizational design, and then there is also evaluating mission, goals, objectives, and behaviors. Long before COVID-19, we evaluated and looked at the variety of work modes, whether you're doing deep production, whether it's analyses, writing, graphic design, or in some cases trading, which is an individualized activity, versus collaborating. And there's various components to collaborating. There is the ideating that Ms. Sargent shared earlier, that co-creation where people are in a room together, whether it's for a few hours or a few days in the tech sector, creating content together. But then there's also another element of collaboration, which is doing quite well in the current context is sequential collaboration, which is very similar to how we're all convening now, where project teams all have their individual tasks and they need to come together to coordinate and assign sequential tasks, break apart and do individualized work. So to get to your question about how, there are a number of things that could or should be done. Of course, we've historically relied on survey data, individual surveying an employee population as well as leadership and management to understand the percentage of time that is spent in these varied work modes. But technology, as technology continues to mature, technology and data has also enabled us to better understand communication and collaboration patterns. So for example, we've been able to discern through social network mapping the frequency of communication across various departments. So the how is somewhat bespoke to the organization, but the overall recommendation would be sentiment surveys, again, opinion, but also augmented with better understanding, breaking down specific tasks, and specifically within those tasks, identifying the individuals or the groups that need to participate in those tasks. And that's the critical component, both for smaller groups, project teams, but also departmental-wide adjacencies and or co-location strategies in terms of the groups that work together most frequently, and then those that may be able to segment that interaction in a few days a week, or in some cases, we're also looking at organizations that are making recommendations around they're going to be in the office a week, a month, and the rest of their activities can happen remotely.
Thank you so much. My last question, Ms. Hanson, I want to ask you as it relates to as we move into a post-COVID environment, particularly cleaning and sanitation. That will continue to be a very important component as we are returning people back to the workforce, whether that's back into the offices entirely or through some sort of hybrid model. I know that even when we were at maximum telework, GSA spent approximately $50 million in activities related to COVID cleaning during the pandemic. You talk a little bit in your testimony that there are systems and technologies that can be used that would improve and reduce the cost of sanitation and cleaning. You talk a little bit about high-efficiency HVAC systems, supplemental air purification units, workforce sanitation standards. Could you just very briefly talk about what it's going to look like as people begin to come back into an office type of environment, the importance of the cleaning and sanitation and some of the tools that are available now that we can use and we can rely on?
Yeah, thank you, Congressperson. It's going to look different, and it's really going to depend on the organization, their mission, their function, their workforce capacity, who they interact with internally and externally. But what I can say is that there's a lot of technology out there already in use and just speeding up its adoption rate. You've mentioned some of the technologies already. A few others are self-certification, whether it's via app or online, mobile air purifiers. We also are looking at, robotics and concierge type services. A lot of this has to do with artificial intelligence and modeling the behavior of people so that there can be preparedness in the tools that they use once they enter the office. The integrated workplace management system, which has replaced the CAPM system of the day, is looking more at how systems are run in a building, how space is managed, and even room reservations, and also providing for more rapid service requests to be made. Another aspect of technology that's important is the idea of high performance computing, right? This is a trending concept that aggregates computing power, because today, compared to even 10 years ago, we've got thousands more pieces of data that need to be processed and thousands more users of this data. So that's one of the ways that you can generate quite a bit of time savings. And the last that I'll say, the data management is key here. When we talk about technology and talk about the ways that it can enhance our not only our environment, but how we do our work, it's got to be integrated. It's got to be interoperable. It's got to be, the data has to be cleansed in order to provide accuracy for decision making, as well. It's got to be accessible. Thank you.
And thank you, Madam Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Norton?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, this hearing is particularly important not only to the government, but to my own district where so many of these office spaces are located. And Ms. Owens-Test, I noted that you mentioned in your testimony that if the government wanted to maintain its favorable negotiating position, it's always been able to negotiate because of who it is and its size and the amount of space it has both here and around the country. You say it will need to continue to reinforce confidence it provides to private sector landlords by continuing to actively pursue new long-term leases. But let me ask you, when there are more vacancies in the commercial real estate market, how can the federal government lose its favorable negotiating position? Perhaps that puts us in a more favorable negotiating position.
You point to something that's very important, and that is that we're currently in a very tenant favorable market. And while the government takes advantage of the tenant favorableness, if you will, of the market, the long-term nature of the leases are one of the features that they then attract better pricing. So what we're advocating for is that the government use the tools that are in their tool belt while they have the upper hand of it being a tenant market, to capture the best deals possible for the government. Long-term leases, and many people will talk about that, long-term leases has been a great success. As GSA has pursued long-term leasing, it's been a great success to capture good pricing within the federal real estate market. The government, the private sector gets the best financing. The government then in turn gets the best rental rates. And all of these, whether it's a new lease at an existing location or a new lease in the marketplace, the private sector is able to respond the best because the government is giving that commitment for a long term. And the financial markets appreciate that long-termness of their leases.
So you're saying pursue as many long-term leases now while the getting is good. Is that it?
Absolutely. You're absolutely right.
Okay, let me go to Ms. Bacon now, because I'm very interested in the workforce, where, as I listen to the testimony, we are likely to see great change. And I was interested, Ms. Bacon, in how important, or at least you spoke about, the importance of consulting employees and workers when making decisions how to allocate office space in the future. Now, I'm thinking about employees who are likely to see considerable change. So both within the federal workplace and more generally, Ms. Bacon, can you expand on the importance and what we can get out of listening to and incorporating the worker perspective when designing these spaces and policies? I'm trying to think of the future now in light of the changes we're seeing.
Thank you. I think that is a very important question. I appreciate that you asked it. The engagement process of a new workplace is really critical. I think someone already mentioned that 80% of an organization or agency's cost is on its people. And yet oftentimes, because of the nature of the upfront capital spend required to design or build out an office, the financial pressures are to require to spend as little as possible. And that's just the nature of the cost structure. So in order to engage a workforce, I do think it's critical because you are able to, again, understand what it is they do, understand the percentage of time they spend in various work modes, understand what is or isn't working in terms of the physical space, but also understand the opportunities for continued remote working or what, especially right now, in terms of as we look at the hybrid future and acknowledging that, as we said, there are productivity gains to be had. I like to shift that word less about productivity because it is subjective to the organization and the individual, but performance is less subjective. Individual performance is critical. And so understanding how well an individual feels they're performing at home, what they need to perform in the office is really important. And again, going back to the need to not leave anyone behind as organizations are looking, and we're hearing some pretty aggressive spatial reduction targets from various agencies, 20%, 30%, in some cases 50%, which we haven't yet validated that that's plausible or healthy for the organization, but we're assessing it. But we need to understand what people's conditions are at home. Do they have enough space to work remote? Do they have the tools they need to work remote? You know, some of the potential space savings that can be had from reducing a portfolio probably needs to be reallocated into the home office equipment and environment and the individual and the technology. But we don't know that without surveying and understanding the workforce. And I talk about surveys, that is one step, and it's an obvious one, pulse surveys, sentiment surveys, et cetera. But it's also important to get those findings and then do focus groups and workshops and really talk to employees to dig deeper as to what the statistical outcomes are. I think, and also as you're embracing and creating a new program, both standard operating procedures, behavioral protocols, a new approach to space. What we're suggesting here in a hybrid future is, with the office becoming more purposeful, we are talking about a reallocation of space to spaces that support varied collaboration, varied ideation, varied activities. And it's important that we understand what those activities are, lest an organization allocate spaces to activities that can be done at home and or are not the coveted use of space. So I think it's a critical thing that every agency and every organization should be doing.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back. My time has passed.
Thank you very much. I think we've lost our other members, so we'll close the hearing, but I want to thank our witnesses. You've given us just excellent information that we can take to our next hearing and present to GSA and get their perspective on it. A couple of things that we haven't discussed that we may reach out to you for more information on is location. That's always a consideration, and certainly impacts, say, mass transit, and if people aren't going to work, what's going to be traffic patterns, where do you locate buildings? I think that's all part of the consideration too now in post-COVID. And we've talked about spacing, but not other health requirements, whether it's vaccinations or a mask or whatever it might be. But we've certainly started the conversation, and we heard that y'all would be excellent witnesses, and certainly that turned out to be true. I will now ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted in writing in the wake of the hearing. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information that will be submitted by the members to be included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. The subcommittee now stands adjourned.
Thank you.